The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Fields, on the Facebook page Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. The campsite and headquarters is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series General Grant Looks at the American Civil War and After, wherein General Grant looks at a person, place, or event in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now as General Grant looks at the post-war years, 1865 through 68 and 9, Grant and Johnson, Part 2. Welcome. I'm glad you've seen fit to join me here in my library. I am General of the Army, Ulysses S. Grant, and I am most pleased to greet you this day with that rank because on July 25th of 1866, Congress passed and created the rank of General of the Army with 4 stars. It's the first of its kind, of its rank with the United States military, and for opposing reasons, Congress and the President Johnson, saw fit to create and award that rank to me. You see, both of them have conflicting opinions and programs as to how to conduct Reconstruction, and the Congress wanted to court my favor to support the radical Congress approach to Reconstruction, to punish the South, make, as President Johnson says, treason odious, the heel on the neck of the vanquished, and so forth, which I didn't care for. I don't think that's the way to go about Reconstruction. And President Johnson's approach to Reconstruction of doing away with the leadership aristocracy of the South and having a Jeffersonian yeoman-like farmer, merchant, rural way of life and government in the South. And President Johnson felt that since his strict constitutional interpretation was that secession was illegal, that those states that claimed this so-called Confederacy, that claimed they'd seceded, had never really in fact seceded. So a reconstruction wasn't necessary, a rejoining or reconnecting. Congress, on the other hand, the radical Congress, which gained control in the 39th and 40th Congresses, felt that the wayward states had indeed left and they had to earn their way back into the Union. And some of those ways to earn was that they had to reconstitute a legislature, write a new constitution banning slavery, and so forth. And they had to also, as a condition, approve both the 13th and the 14th Amendments. None of the southern states, 10 of them, did not. The 11th, Tennessee, did, but Tennessee was the first one to get back into the Union. President Johnson felt that the 13th and 14th Amendments were indeed unconstitutional and were an overreach. So, as you can see, they were at perpendicular loggerheads, cross purposes, and how to proceed with the country after the war was over. I was in the middle because I felt that punishment was not necessary. We needed to come back together and heal as a country, and doing what either one of these parties replace the president with presidential reconstruction or Congress with congressional reconstruction. Was neither one of those programs was designed to heal and bring back together our scarred country. But they both felt, come up with the act to create a new rank, 4-star rank. Congress did, that I would court my favor. President Johnson was in hearty agreement. It may have been the only time that he and Congress agreed that get the rank, because he signed off on it with me being named, that he would court my favor. So both wanted to court my favor. Neither got my favor, but I, in the middle, got my 4th star and the newly created rank of General of the Army. Everything pretty much went downhill from there. That was July the 25th of 1866. Now, President Johnson and I got along at first, as I mentioned earlier, but he quickly saw that I was not fully supportive of what he was doing. And he also went his own way with Congress and myself. In December of 67, after the Tenure of Office Act has been passed, President Johnson saw fit to suspend Secretary of War Stanton. Now, there was a great deal of questioning about the Tenure of Office Act. It said essentially that any position that had to be approved by Congress, a cabinet position, that before any of those members could be dismissed, then Congress had to approve the dismissal. Well, that was aimed at punishing President Johnson and ensuring that Congress was able to determine who was in the cabinet and who stayed there. President Johnson was not alone in being unable to get along with Secretary of War Stanton, and felt that Stanton needed to go when he put him out of office. He wanted me to be the Secretary of War, and I declined that. But I was, much against my will and better judgment, I did for a few weeks serve as an interim Secretary of War. Also, going on about this time, in December of 67, President Johnson put Stanton out. In January of 68, Congress, the Senate refused to approve that, and I had the job temporarily. And everything rapidly began to disintegrate for President Johnson. He issued in February, he did two things happened. In February of 68, he issued an executive order, since Congress, the Senate, wouldn't go along with it, to oust Secretary of War Stanton. Congress, the Senate, I should say, did not take kindly to that, and Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thad Stevens in the House both despised virulently President Johnson and anything he did. But they wanted to maintain control of that cabinet. And I should also say the Tenure of Office Act was an extreme overreach on the authority of Congress, of the Senate, and it would, if it had stood, would have changed our government. Instead of three equal parts, legislative and executive and judicial, it would have been essentially judicial and legislative, because the Senate would have controlled who the president had in his cabinet, and therefore would have controlled the presidency. So its ultimate demise was a beneficial event for the country. But in February 68, they voted to not approve of Stanton's removal, and they also voted to impeach President Johnson. And in May of 68, I was nominated for the presidency by the National Union Republican Party, but more about that later. In June of 68, President Johnson voted against the readmission of several states, and Congress promptly overrode the veto, actually, same day. And that was actually the culmination, really, of all of his struggles, because they had failed to impeach him on 11 different articles of impeachment, and he was saved by one vote, so one vote does count. And I was elected or nominated to be the president candidate for the National Union Republican Party in May. Now, by the time that happened, any semblance of any communication between President Johnson and myself were over. It was perfunctory. We avoided each other. And instead of a marriage in heaven, which it should have been, it was an unholy, acrimonious relationship that was doomed to failure. But let me go back a bit and talk about the previous year or so. In March of '67, there were 3 vetoes that the president had overridden. He had the first and second and third Reconstruction Acts, and the first one was overridden a few days after it was sent to Congress. The second and third were overridden same day, actually within minutes of the veto being received by Congress. So the Congress was not going to support President Johnson in anything he did. He was a lame duck from the moment almost from the moment he took office. He did not have a honeymoon, being catapulted into the office with President Lincoln's murder, and promptly began to alienate everybody around him. But the Congress, radical Congress, wanted to punish the South, as I've said, and Johnson didn't, so they quickly began to drift apart. And for the first time, a president had legislation vetoes overridden, and they became overridden the second and third Reconstruction that day. And that just set a precedent. But in a good part of all of this, we got Alaska. Secretary of State Seward negotiated with Russia to get Alaska, I believe, for some $15 or $17 million. I'm not sure, but it was just a few cents an acre. Call Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and so forth. I don't know. I hope it becomes beneficial to our country, but Seward is certainly happy with it, and I think that Congress is going to approve it. And in May of '67, Jefferson Davis was freed on parole. In fact, Horace Greeley was one of the people who paid for his bail. So Davis got out of prison after 2 years in prison at Fort Monroe, and I was glad to see that. There was no need to keep him there with a 24-hour-a-day guard, with 2 guards in the room with him at all times. That was another overreach on the part of the government to have treated Jefferson Davis in that manner. In July '67, the third Reconstruction Act was passed, vetoed, and the veto overridden. Now, what's happened in these Reconstruction Acts? The first one divided the 10 states in the South. Now, the 11th state in the so-called Confederacy was Tennessee, which quickly went back into the Union under, as I recall, the Lincoln Plan. 10% of the voters in the 1860 census approved the going back into the Union. They came back in quickly, and since they were Johnson's home state, President Johnson is a Tennessean, that went without much challenge. So the other 10 states are trying to get back into the Union. They're trying to get, and President Johnson wants them back in the Union with the constitutions that they had in existence and the legislatures that they had in existence. Now, you'll recall that those constitutions permitted slavery, and that could not be. That the constitutions needed to be rewritten before they could fully rejoin the Union. President Johnson is saying they never left. Their constitutions don't need to be rewritten. Well, when in the next year's election in '66 elections, when Congress or the Republicans won substantial majorities in both houses, veto proof majorities, then the the approach to how the states got back in the Union became considerably tougher. And the requirements were that those states had to first get a provisional legislature in place. Then they had to rewrite their state constitution, which specifically prohibited slavery forever and gave the right, once the citizenship, to freed Negroes. And it also said that they had to approve, ratify, a condition for reentry into the Union, both the 13th and the 14th Amendments. Now, none of the 10 Southern states ratified the 13th and 14th Amendments, which cost them dearly later in the radical Republican Congress. But that's what they had to do to get back in. The first Reconstruction Act had divided those 10 states into 5 military districts, and with a general commanding with authority over the civilian governments, and I was to choose those generals. So the occupation of the so-called Confederacy became a reality. Something that irritated the Southerners was that in our strong and consistent efforts to reduce the size of the Army, we went from 1 million men in April of '65 to 227,000, I believe, by the end of 1865, that the earliest enlisting troops got out first. That left, obviously, the later enlisting troops to get out last. And many of those later enlistments were USCT. So, through sheer numbers, with no intent on anybody's part, about 30% of the Army was USCT. And their presence was particularly aggravating in the South to people who were their former masters, or certainly in general, the ruling class now has occupation troops, and many of them, a third of them, are black troops. That didn't sit well. So Johnson was opposing everything the Radical Congress put forth and vetoing right and left. And then Congress began overriding every veto. The sore point between him and myself was that he wanted to get Stanton, Secretary of War Stanton, out. And he wanted me to be the interim. Actually, I think he wanted me to be the Secretary of War, and I wanted nothing to do with that. And we talked about what to do. In fact, at one point, he was afraid that Congress was going to have him arrested or ousted from the presidency. And he asked me what I would do about it. And I said, I will follow the law, which he interpreted, and as did I, that I would obey the directions of the president. And he was comfortable with that. But also, he had the understanding that I was going to stay in that position indefinitely. I had no intention of that. So in February of '68, when Congress overrode his, I believe his third time he put Stanton out of office, they said, no, this is illegal. It violates the Tenure of Office Act. And I, I told the president that I had reread that Tenure of Office Act. It called for a fine, as I recall, $10,000 a day and I think 5 years imprisonment for violating that law. When I heard that, or read that, I went to the president and told him such, and I said, I can't afford $10,000 a day, and I'm certainly not going to prison. And Johnson said, maybe he was joking, but he said, I'll pay the fine and I'll do the prison time. Well, I thought, I'm not so sure about that, Mr. President. But when Congress overturned that third time of putting Stanton out of office, I had they had ruled the Tenure of Office Act must be followed. I went to the War Department and locked up the office, went to Alonzo Thomas as the Adjutant General, and I gave him the keys to Secretary Stanton's office, walked back across the street to the War Department, wrote a letter to the President telling him what I'd done. Within, I think, just a few hours, Secretary Stanton was in the office and barricaded himself in for the next couple of months. President Johnson was really unhappy with me because he said I'd betrayed him. And in fact, at the next cabinet meeting we had, I was there for military matters, and when he got to the military matters, he began to berate me in the cabinet meeting for having betrayed him and not fulfilled my duties. And I very deliberately explained to him what I felt my duties to be, and then I left the cabinet meeting. So as you can see, President Johnson and I had a very bumpy and as it turned out, ill-fated relationship because I disagreed with everything he was doing, and I felt he was consistently trying to manipulate me. Matters weren't helped in our relationship when in May the 20th, 21st, the National Union Republican Party in the Crosby Opera House in Chicago, Illinois, nominated me to be their presidential candidate. 650 delegates voted unanimously for me to be the party's candidate, and Schuyler Colfax, who'd been Speaker of the House, from South Bend, Indiana, Shoemaker, originally was named as my vice presidential candidate. And one of the battle cries that they mentioned was match him. Ulysses S. Grant for president, match him. Well, I'm now running for the presidency of the United States. Sherman took me to task and asked me why. Well, I can sanitize what he said to me by saying, he said, why did you do that? And I told him I didn't want to do that, but I had no choice, because if I had not run for the presidency, everything, as I told him, everything that you and I and that 2 million American soldiers, everything we fought for, everything we did, would be to naught, lost to trading politicians, and I could not let that happen. So I accepted the call, and on May 29th, I wrote a formal acceptance and ended it with, let us have peace, which had many different applications, but it became also a battle cry for my running for the presidency. In our interactions, President Johnson and myself, were limited after that. Now, Johnson wanted the Democratic candidacy, but he didn't get it. They nominated Seymour out of New York, and his running mate was Frank Blair, and they lost to me. I received, I think it was 214 electoral college votes to their 80. So it was a convincing victory on my part in November of 1868. And the popular vote was closer than that. But my campaign for the presidency and my election is food for another evening here in the library. And we took office March the 4th of 1869. The 14th Amendment had been ratified in July of 1868, and the 15th Amendment was proposed in February of 1869, just before I took office. Something of note, on December, I think it was December the 25th, President Johnson signed a pardon for everyone who participated in the Civil War fighting against the United States, which cleared Jefferson Davis, and the matter of what to do with him was laid to rest to the great relief of everybody. And I was still General of the Army, General in Chief, but I did not resign that rank. I did not resign from the Army until the morning of my inauguration, March the 4th of 1869, because I was not about to let Andy Johnson name somebody else to my rank, my position, before I left that position to inherit that individual when I took the office of the presidency. So I held on to it just before I left to go take the oath of office. A final note about President Johnson and myself and my inauguration. Johnson and I did not get along at all. He didn't even get the Democratic nomination for the presidency, and he wanted that second term, a term on his own, and didn't get it. So he was angry about that. He was very angry at me because I didn't do anything that he wanted me to do. Certainly not to the extent he wanted it either. But I had made it clear that, well, he made it clear he wasn't going to ride to the inauguration in the same carriage with me. And perhaps he thought that was insulting. It was a great relief to me because I'd made it clear I wasn't going to ride in the same carriage with him up Pennsylvania Avenue to the inauguration. So he did not come to my inauguration. There was precedent for that, though, because John Adams did not go to Thomas Jefferson's inauguration when he succeeded Adams. In fact, I understand Adams left the White House at 4 o'clock in the morning, the morning of Jefferson's inauguration. But Johnson did not attend my inauguration. And on March the 4th of 1869, I succeeded Andrew Johnson and became the 18th President of the United States. In this talk tonight, I hope that I've conveyed the acrimony that was present. I hope I've conveyed the confusion that Johnson precipitated in Congress, the anger that he precipitated, that Congress passed law after law that he vetoed, that they quickly overrode, many on within minutes of receiving the veto. He got very little accomplished in his presidency, unless you count how many people he made angry and how angry he made them. He was successful at that. But March the 4th of 1869, all that was over. Andrew Johnson went back to Tennessee, and I went to the executive mansion. I believe that for this meeting that we've come together, I've said quite enough. So until we come together again in the library or the parlor, I must take my leave of you and bid you, as General of the Army, President-elect Ulysses S. Grant, I bid you a fond and affectionate adieu.